An evolutionary ecologist goes to the Art Institute. To be clear, you're that evolutionary ecologist. I will be at the museum, the Art Institute, tomorrow from 11:30 and will stay through till the end of class. You are more than welcome to join me at that time, but you can complete this assignment at your own pace on any day you want, as long as you've got it completed by Sunday and the report loaded up at that time. The Darwinian Wallacean revolution of the 1850s was not the discovery of a pattern of evolutionary descent amongst living things. Many others had remarked on that before. Rather, it was the positing of a very specific, very simple mechanism by which this change could occur. That mechanism, natural selection, accounts for how the differential reproductive success of organisms in the struggle for existence can account for changes in the attributes of individuals within a population over successive generations. Famously, Darwin hinted in The Origin of Species that this mechanism would illuminate the biological history of humans. For example, towards the conclusion of that book he wrote, "In the distant future, I see open fields for far more important researches. Psychology will be based on a new foundation, that of the necessary acquirement of each mental power and capacity by gradation. Light will be thrown," he writes, "on the origin of man and his history." It's not until the 1870s, with the publication of The Descent of Man and the Selection in Relation to Sex, 1872, and in his notebooks, that Darwin really began to flesh out the implications of his theory for humankind. A century and a half later, we're still arguably trying to determine specifically how humans are shaped by their evolutionary past. Quite obviously, humans share many of their needs with other animals. We eat, for example, rather than photosynthesize like plants. We shit, unlike plants that have a variety of mechanisms, from guttation to abscission of leaves, that conveys their wastes away. And like many mammals, metabolically, we run quite hot. Even our braininess, which we flatter ourselves in thinking is the most highly evolved form of cerebration, it is merely an extension of the primate condition. In addition to our physical characteristics, our behaviors and affectivity, our capacity to harbor feelings and emotions are arguably under the influence of some ancient evolutionary business. Nico Tinbergen, a favorite scientist of mine, a founder of the field of ethology or animal behavior studies, thus famously proposed that we can understand a behavior by asking 4 questions. So in addition to querying the proximate causes of a behavior, that is, asking about the underlying brain function, the hormones and the like, and also questions about how the behavior develops during the course of lifetime, with the ontogeny, to use a $100 technical term, we can propose these 2 evolutionary questions. What is the evolutionary function of behavior? That is, what is its adaptive value? And secondly, how did this behavior evolve in phylogeny? When did it emerge in the history of the species? To illustrate, we can assume that, like other animals, we read and respond to aspects of the environment and landscape in a reflexive way. We have an inclination to recoil from spiders and snakes. We react to red coloration cautiously. The tendencies towards biophobic reactions are more pronounced in some than in others, but most of us have these tendencies. Conversely, and this is a newer field of study, humans have the opposite reaction, a biophilic one to nature in many circumstances. The allure of a beautiful sunset, the comfort of soft breezes, the call of the whippoorwill, a bird, and even the allure of our pets. E.O. Wilson, who coined the term, defines biophilia in the following way. It's the inborn affinity human beings have for other forms of life, an affiliation evoked according to circumstance by pleasure, a sense of security or awe, or even by fascination blended with revulsion. One particular aspect of this awakening to the possibility that place matters for our health and well-being in ways that can be both subtle and profound comes from an inspection of human relation to landscapes. In one popular, though arguably difficult to test, version of this thinking, Gordon Orion suggests that since we evolved on the savannah or in savannah conditions, this is the landscape that pleases us most. Thus, the humans have made a savannah, that is grasses with interspersed timbers, out of the world. We've transformed the world into our ancient habitat. If this idea appeals to you, I recommend you read Snakes, Sunrises and Shakespeare, How Evolution Shapes Our Loves and Fears by Orions. J. Appleton, the British cultural geographer, has an intriguing route for examining the question of how landscapes can influence affectivity. This is referred to as the theory of prospect and refuge. In one of his books on the topic, An Interpretation of Landscape in the Arts, Appleton, according to his publishers, asserts in this insightful analysis that the aesthetic value in landscapes are not to be found in an elevated philosophy of aesthetics or in a culturally bound artistic symbolism, but in the biological and behavioral needs we share with other animals. I should mention that I'm rather a fan of elevated philosophy of aesthetics, but let's take his point. So, what in all of this is his theory? Here it is summarized by Dawson and Ostwald. They say that the theory of prospect and refuge seeks to describe why certain environments feel secure and thereby meet basic human psychological needs. Environments that meet such needs are will often provide people with the capacity to observe, which is called prospect, without being seen, which he calls refuge. So, prospect is the capacity to observe out into the landscape, and refuge is a place in the landscape from which one can be protected from view. Armed with this admittedly minimal account of Appleton's ideas, we can look at landscape art and not just ponder the traditional symbols of, for instance, we can ask of this painting, why is the church above the cross? Why are the trees symmetrically arrayed around the cross, and so on? But rather, we can look at this same landscape with our animal suits on, so to speak. Is this a habitat where we could feel comfortable, where we could subsist? If you were in this landscape, could you find a refuge? For instance, I'm illustrating one here with the red oval. This would be a refuge in that landscape from which you could get prospect across the wider landscape but be protected from it. To the presence of these elements, prospect and refuge, a place for us to sequester ourselves, to protect ourselves, a place from which to view the landscape, make a painting more appealing? Does it evoke a sense of security? Does the absence of a refuge, does the full glare of the landscape upon the viewer provoke a sense of an unsettling sense? So the artist, from the perspective of this view of things, is just one animal depicting an environment to another, that is you and me. So what's your assignment? Recapitulating, we've seen that previously landscapes have been viewed through kind of an aesthetic lens or from a cross-cultural lens. The argument here that I'm asking you to think about is that landscapes embed perennial truths about the relationship between humans and the environment. The choice of landscape elements depicted in any work are going to express the artist's way of framing this relationship. I'm asking you to look for these things. So you could conjecture that paintings that are intended by the artist to provoke a sense of untroubled beauty or awe, of calmness, for example, are dominated by water, trees, benign natural elements, and so on. Whereas those landscapes that are intended to communicate terror, of ennui, disconnection, distress, challenge, are going to communicate through different symbols: rockfalls, storms, turbulence in the landscape, and so on. Furthermore, the positioning of humans in the landscape can be revealing. Are those humans in the landscape in a refuge with a prospect out on the environment? Or are they exposed to the landscape? Or if there's no human in the landscape, can you see where there would be a refuge for you, and does that change the way in which you're responding to this work of art? In the exercise, I'm asking you to consider these relationships. Though it's not a definitive test, it could be considered the initial steps in this analysis. At the very least, it should help you to generate some observations, allowing a useful discussion about the relationship between humans and the environment, and how this then gets depicted in art. So specifically, I want you to locate 15 works of art. There are about 15, certainly 10 or more, depending upon the amount of time you are spending with each piece. You don't. I'm not going to ask you to use a table, but rather, as I've given you a kind of list of things to note about each painting. Specifically, jot down the name, the artist, the year, and then kind of inquire about whether it is a depiction of wild nature, and is there water present in the painting? What are the major other landscape elements, the other visual elements in the landscape? Note your subjective mood, your response to the piece. How is it making you feel? Is it beautiful? Is it anxiety producing? Do you feel disconnected or discombobulated and the like? Note as well whether there's humans in the landscape. Are they in a refuge, or are they exposed to the landscape? And then any other additional notes. When you are finished with each, and as I said, you just need to jot these down in a notebook, replicating the sheet that I gave you in class the other day. But after your visit, you are going to want to qualitatively assess the data that you've got. Is there a relationship between the composition, the elements within the landscape, and the emotions that they're provoking in you? What do your observations reveal about general nature of representation of nature in landscape art, and so on? I ask you to think a little bit about if you were to try and take this to the next stage and develop a more systematic scientific study of this phenomenon. How would you go about it? And in particular,